Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. No matter where you are at, thank you for clicking on this video today. My name is Matthew Bonig, and this is another episode of CDK Releases. In this episode, we're going to be talking about version 2.29.0 and the point release 2.29.1. I'll be covering all the features, the fixes, and then I'll pick out my favorite feature, my favorite fix, and then I'll talk about the MVP for this release. All right, let's get into it. First up, on API Gateway, they added a Lambda integration options for the Lambda REST API. So if you're working with that Lambda REST API, you can now add in some additional integration options that weren't there before. EKS now allows for the use of the Graviton 3 processors. We saw in the last release a similar change for EC2, and now that change is carried over into EKS as well. The CFN spec has been updated to 76.0.0. Unless you're working with L1 constructs, this probably won't matter a whole lot to you. The event targets for CloudWatch has got an additional option for a DLQ for SNS targets. So if you set up an SNS target for an event bridge message and for some reason things are configured incorrectly or it just can't be processed, that DLQ can now pick that message up and hold it for you. Lambdas get a change that allow for a larger inline code size, probably not using inline functions too much, but previously there was a limit of 4K for those inline functions, but the Lambda service removed that and CloudFormation removed that restriction, so now that carries over the CDK as well. Pipelines now adds an additional support for supplying the code build step for caching. So if you want to leverage like an S3 bucket for your caching and code build, that option is now available to you when you're setting things up through Code Pipeline. Route 53 gets a new option for replacing existing records. Let's dive into this real quick. This one is kind of an interesting one, and this is going to get my feature of the week. Route 53 now gets on the record set object a delete existing property. So if you choose to set this to true, then when the record gets created, instead of using the standard CloudFormation resource, it's going to use a custom resource for managing that record, which means that when that record already exists, CloudFormation can overwrite its existing value. This is actually really useful for cases where you're going to be doing blue-green type swaps on systems, or maybe you're needing to replace a system as a whole and you're using DNS as that entry point to do the swap. This is a really great feature of a problem that I've ran across a number of times when trying to manage DNS records through Route 53 and not being able to do it very well through infrastructure as code with the standard CloudFormation. So this is a really cool new feature and definitely getting my feature of the week. Secrets Manager is getting a new option to exclude characters for hosted rotations. So let's dive into this. So by default, we're going to use the excluded characters of the secret if available, or if the same default exclude characters as the ones for RDS. So when we're doing rotations, we're going to exclude out some characters that could cause you problems in the long run. And finally, in the features, there is a new one for service discovery. We're going to add hosted zone ID as an attribute to the namespace. If we go and look into this, this was related to a ticket opened up back in May 26th. And basically what this does is just add a new external property to the resource that says our namespace hosted zone ID. So very useful for the service discovery. All right, moving on to fixes. We've got and the auto scaling module, the OS type was wrong when using the CloudFormation init, so that has been fixed up. Our code pipeline, we cannot deploy pipeline stack with cross-account keys twice. So this was a case where if you were using a code pipeline that had cross-account deployments going from, say, a dev to a staging to a production environment, going through different AWS accounts, when that stack was being created, it was being done in such a way that the KMS key aliases were not unique, so you couldn't deploy the stack more than once. This is through a feature flag, so if you need to leverage this and you do need to deploy these stacks multiple times, make sure you turn on that feature flag first. In core functionality, CFN mappings weren't able to be used in other stacks. If you tried to reference one across stack references, things were failing. This has now been fixed up through some fancy copying of CFN mappings between stacks. Also in core, the durations, there were a number of functions like 2 seconds or 2 minutes, and when you were converting these things back and forth, their values were getting a little messed up along the way. So this fix resolved that error. In the event targets module for event bridge targets, the CloudWatch logs requires a very specific input template. This was an issue where you could meet the requirements of the interface for the construct, but your CloudWatch logs wouldn't really get written correctly and you wouldn't notice it until after deploy time and during a runtime scenario. This change introduces a new property on the construct, which is specifically for doing these CloudWatch events and makes things a bunch easier to work through and clear and cleaner to do. So we can see here the CloudWatch log group and the log group target inputs being used. And in this case, there's much clearer use of the timestamp and the message fields. And it's this fix that's going to get my fix of the release, because anytime we make interfaces easier and better to use, that's going to benefit everybody in the long term and certainly gets us to pushing any sort of issues or errors closer and further to the right towards the developers and pulling them away from runtime issues, which are always much more painful to find. In IAM, the default policy name was preventing overwrites of each other in multi-stack deployments, so that's been fixed up. Also, duplicate policy statements were leading to too many overflow policies, so that's now also been resolved. The init templates, this is a carryover from the 0.1 release that we saw in 2.28.1, where TypeScript projects were not being initialized. As with any point release, it always carries over as a change log in the next feature release. So we see that here. And finally, on Route 53, there is some proved hosted zone ID error messages. Again, always good when error messages get cleaned up and are easier to read and easier to understand. So always a good thing there. So this is a quick fix to the pipelines module. In this case, what was happening was a code build project that is used with the confirm permissions broadening feature didn't have the code build image specified, so it was falling back to the code build standard 2.0, and that is still running the old version of node 12, and we want to get everything on node 14. So a quick change there to make this run on standard 5.0 instead of the 2.0 image. All right, so let's go ahead and review the feature, the fix, and the MVP for this release. So the feature of the release for 2.29.0 is this Route 53 change, which allows us to more easily manage our Route 53 records without having to worry about conflicting IAC changes. So the best fix for this release is going to be this CloudWatch event targets, in which the better CloudWatch logs input template has been defined and a cleaner interface there. Again, pushing changes right to the developers, allowing problems to be surfaced earlier. All right, and finally for the MVPs for this release, where we highlight the top contributors for this release. First is to Calvin Combs, who did 2 changes to this release this week. And then second is to Jonathan Goldwasser, who also had 2 changes and 2 PRs in this release this week. So thank you to both of you for contributing so much to the CDK. All right, so that's it for this release video. If you liked it, please give me a like and a thumbs up. It really helps me out and helps me understand if these videos are valuable to you. If you want to see more of these in the future, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And finally, if you have any constructive criticism on how I can improve these videos, please leave a comment below. As always, thank you, and I'll see you next time.